A little black girl promised to marry a mountain man, and 20 years later, she did. Dust swirls on a lonely frontier street. A church bell tolls in the distance. A hardened mountain man, alone for decades, locks eyes with the grown woman he once saved as a child. She's back, and she hasn't forgotten her vow. Whispers ripple through the town. Some laugh, some sneer, and one powerful rancher steps forward with a shocking claim. She doesn't belong to herself. She belongs to him. Now, with the whole town watching, a promise made by a frightened little girl is tested in the harshest way. Ledger books hide secrets. A church door slams open, rifles glint in the lamplight, and a love born in fire faces its greatest trial. Will the vow that began in blood and loss finally be fulfilled, or torn apart by lies, prejudice, and a past that refuses to die? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Dawn broke harsh and sudden over the Texas settlement that morning in 1859. The first golden rays had barely touched the tops of the mesquite trees when the raiders struck. Dust clouds rose as horses thundered through the cluster of wooden buildings, their riders whooping and firing shots into the air. The peaceful morning shattered into chaos. Among the settlers running for safety was a woman clutching her 5-year-old daughter's hand. Hannah's mother pulled her through the panicked crowd, her dark eyes scanning for shelter. The wooden wagon ahead offered their only hope. She crouched down, her calloused hands gentle on Hannah's shoulders. "Stay here, child." "Don't make a sound." Her voice was steady, despite the fear in her eyes. She tucked Hannah beneath the wagon, using an old blanket to shield her from view. "The Lord will watch over you." Hannah huddled in the shadows, her small frame trembling as she watched her mother's feet move away. Through gaps in the wagon boards, she saw her mother grab a kitchen knife from her apron. The blade caught the early morning light. Boots pounded the dirt. Rough voices shouted. Hannah pressed her hands over her mouth to stay quiet, just as her mother had taught her. She saw her mother's skirts swish as she turned to face the attackers. The kitchen knife flashed once, twice. A man cursed. Then came the terrible sound, the dull thud of a rifle butt striking flesh. Her mother crumpled to the ground just feet from the wagon. Hannah wanted to scream, but terror froze her voice. Tears streamed down her face as she watched her mother's hand, still clutching the knife, go limp in the dust. The raiders' horses galloped past, kicking up clouds that stung Hannah's eyes. She stayed absolutely still, remembering her mother's words about being quiet, even as smoke began to fill the air and the crackle of flames grew louder. The sounds of violence gradually faded, replaced by the hollow sound of wind and burning wood. Hannah remained hidden, her body aching from staying so still. The smoke grew thicker. Her mother hadn't moved. The clip-clop of a single horse's hooves made her shrink further into her hiding place. These steps were slower, more cautious than the raiders' wild galloping. Through her tears, Hannah saw boots hit the ground, worn leather caked with trail dust. The stranger walked slowly, surveying the destruction. The boots stopped near her mother. Hannah heard a deep sigh, then watched as the man knelt down, checking for signs of life. His movements were gentle, respectful. When he stood, his shadow fell across Hannah's hiding place. "Dear Lord," the man's voice was rough but kind. "What happened here?" Hannah couldn't hold back a small sniffle. The boots turned sharply toward the wagon. The stranger crouched down, and Hannah saw his face for the first time. Weather-worn and bearded, but with eyes that reminded her of the way her mother looked at her, full of caring. This was Dale, though she wouldn't learn his name until later that night. "Hello there, little one," he said softly. "It's safe now. You can come out." Hannah shook her head, pressing herself further back. "I won't hurt you," Dale promised. He stayed where he was, patient, unthreatening. Was that your mama? The tears came faster now. Hannah nodded. I'm mighty sorry about your mama. She must have been real brave, protecting you like that. Dale's voice grew thick. Would you let me help you? Get you somewhere safe? Hannah looked past him to where her mother lay. Mama said stay quiet. You did real good staying quiet. Your mama would be proud. Dale settled himself more comfortably in the dust. But she'd want you safe now. There's some food in my saddlebags, and my horse is gentle. Would you like to meet him? Several minutes passed before Hannah finally crawled forward. Dale didn't rush her. When she emerged, he draped his coat around her shoulders, sheltering her from the sight of her mother's body. He lifted her carefully, and Hannah buried her face in his buckskin shirt, breathing in the scent of leather and wood smoke. Dale gathered what supplies he could salvage, then lifted Hannah onto his horse. Before leaving, he took time to dig a proper grave, marking it with a cross made from wagon wood. Hannah watched him work, clutching the edge of his coat around her shoulders. They rode until sunset, Dale choosing a sheltered spot among the mesquite trees to make camp. He built a small fire and set about preparing their meal, keeping his movements slow and steady. Hannah hadn't spoken since leaving the settlement, but her eyes followed his every move. Hungry? Dale asked, stirring the pot of beans. Got some cornbread, too, though it's a mite hard from the trail. The familiar smell of cooking food seemed to wake something in Hannah. She edged closer to the fire, accepting the tin plate Dale offered. The beans were hot and filling, the cornbread softened when dipped in the bean juice. As the stars began appearing overhead, Hannah finally found her voice again. Will you leave me too? Dale set his plate down, choosing his words carefully. I aim to get you somewhere safe, a proper place with good folks who'll care for you. I don't want to be alone. Hannah's voice quavered. She looked up at Dale, her young face serious in the firelight. When I grow up, I'll marry you. Then you can't leave. Dale couldn't help but chuckle softly at the solemnity of her declaration. But seeing the tears threatening in her eyes, he gentled his response. That's a mighty big promise for such a little lady. I mean it, Hannah insisted, her chin set stubbornly despite her trembling lower lip. Dale's expression softened. He reached out slowly and patted her small hand. Tell you what, I promise to make sure you're safe and cared for. That's a solemn vow before God and these Texas stars. Hannah nodded, apparently satisfied with this compromise. She scooted closer to the fire, and to Dale as the night grew cooler. Soon her eyes began to droop, the exhaustion of the terrible day finally catching up with her. Dale wrapped her in his coat again and settled her near the fire. He kept watch through the night, his rifle across his knees, listening to the coyotes calling in the distance. Every so often, he'd glance at the sleeping child, marveling at the trust she'd placed in him. The next morning, they rode out early. Dale knew of a church-run orphanage a day's ride away. The sisters there had a reputation for kindness and good care. As they traveled, he pointed out interesting sights, a family of deer, a hawk soaring overhead, wildflowers painting the prairie in bright colors. Hannah slowly began to respond, asking questions in her small voice. When they reached the orphanage, the sisters welcomed them with genuine warmth. Dale explained the situation while Hannah clung to his leg, suddenly shy again. Sister Mary Catherine knelt down to Hannah's level, speaking softly about the other children who would love to be her friends. The moment of parting was difficult. Hannah's fingers twisted in Dale's buckskin shirt as he hugged her goodbye. Remember my promise, he said gruffly, his own throat tight. You'll be safe here. Hannah's whispered thank you followed him as he mounted his horse. He tipped his hat to the sisters, then turned toward the trail. But he couldn't help looking back one last time, seeing Hannah's small figure standing beside Sister Mary Catherine, watching him ride away. Dale would remember that moment for years to come. The weight of the promise he'd made, and the even more solemn vow she'd made to him. Though he couldn't know it then, that day would change both their lives forever. The Colorado Highlands stretched endlessly beneath an autumn sky, their peaks already dusted with early snow. Dale's cabin stood against the mountainside like it had grown there naturally, weathered logs silvered by 20 years of sun and storm. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, carrying the scent of pine into the crisp afternoon air. Dale worked methodically at his sharpening wheel, the steady rhythm matching the beat of his solitary life. Sparks flew as he pressed a hunting knife against the stone, his movements precise from years of practice. At 40, his hands were strong and steady, though lines had deepened around his eyes from squinting into mountain winds. The cabin's interior, visible through the open door, spoke of a life built on self-reliance. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, their fragrance mixing with leather and wood smoke. A rifle stood ready by the door, well-oiled and maintained. Everything had its place. Everything served a purpose. Pausing his work, Dale tested the knife's edge with his thumb. The blade gleamed, ready for the coming hunting season. He'd need to check his trap lines soon. The trading post in Redford would be expecting their regular delivery of pelts. Redford. The thought of the mountain town pulled at him. He'd need supplies before winter set in properly. Setting the knife aside, Dale gathered his trading goods. Carefully cured pelts, dried herbs, and the jerky he'd made from last season's elk. The town was half a day's ride away, but he'd make it before sunset if he started now. The mare nickered softly as he saddled her, comfortable with their routine. Dale packed his goods carefully, then swung into the saddle. The trail to Redford wound through aspen groves gone golden with autumn, their leaves whispering secrets to the wind. By late afternoon, Dale rode into Redford's main street. The town had grown some over the years, but not much. A few new buildings had sprung up, including Widow Chen's boarding house, but the hitching posts still wore the same grooves from years of rope wear. The sound of an approaching stagecoach echoed off the buildings. Dale guided his mare to the side of the street, watching as the dust-covered vehicle rattled to a stop. Such arrivals were common enough, usually bringing mail or the occasional businessman from Denver. But something about this arrival caught Dale's attention. Perhaps it was the way the woman who stepped down moved, graceful despite the journey's wear. Her traveling dress was plain but well-made, and she carried herself with quiet dignity. When she turned to retrieve a small trunk, Dale caught a glimpse of her face that stirred something in his memory, but he pushed the thought aside. Mr. Peterson, who ran the general store, hurried forward to help with the trunk. Dale could hear the woman's voice, clear and musical, asking about someone. He was too far away to catch the name, but something in her tone made him pause. Shaking off the strange feeling, Dale continued to the trading post. He had business to attend to, and the sun was already sliding toward the mountains. The familiar routine of trading grounded him, negotiating prices for his pelts, selecting supplies he'd need. By the time he finished, evening was spreading purple shadows through the streets. Widow Chen's boarding house was the only place in town that served proper meals, so Dale made his way there, as he always did when in Redford. The dining room was warm and filled with the scent of cooking. He took his usual corner table, nodding to the other diners he knew by sight, if not by name. The door opened, bringing a rush of cool evening air. Dale looked up, and 20 years fell away like autumn leaves in a storm. She stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the last light of day. No longer the frightened child he'd found beneath a wagon, but a woman grown. Her eyes, when they met his, held the same determination he remembered, and something more. Hannah moved through the room with deliberate steps, stopping at his table. "Hello, Dale," she said softly, her voice carrying echoes of that night by a mesquite-shadowed campfire. "I've been asking after you." Dale's hands gripped his coffee cup, the ceramic warm against his suddenly cold fingers. "Hannah," he managed, his voice rough. You're a long way from Texas." 20 years is a long time to wait," she said, sitting down across from him. The lamplight caught gold highlights in her dark hair, now styled simply but elegantly. "But I'm here to keep my promise." Dale's heart stumbled in its steady rhythm. "Promise?" he asked, though he knew, Lord, how he knew, exactly what she meant. Hannah's smile held a gentle certainty that shook him more than any mountain storm. "I told you I would marry you when I grew up. So you wouldn't have to be alone anymore." She folded her hands on the table, and Dale noticed they were strong hands, marked by honest work. "And neither would I." "Hannah," Dale set his cup down carefully, fighting for words. You were just a child, after everything you'd been through." "I was a child," she agreed, her eyes never leaving his face. "But I'm not anymore. I've thought about that promise every day since. The sisters at the orphanage raised me well, taught me useful skills. I'm a seamstress now, a good one. I've made my own way in the world." Dale studied her, seeing the truth of her words. The frightened girl had grown into a woman of quiet strength. Her clothes, though simple, showed expert craftsmanship. She carried herself with the dignity of someone who knew their own worth. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why come all this way for a promise made in grief?" Hannah leaned forward slightly, her voice low but firm. "Because that promise wasn't born of grief, Dale. It was born of recognition. Even at 5 years old, I saw something in you, something true and honorable. You could have left me there, among the ashes. Instead, you treated me with kindness and respect. You made sure I was safe." Dale remembered that long-ago night, the small figure wrapped in his coat, trusting him despite everything she'd lost. Any decent man would have done the same. "But it wasn't any man," Hannah said simply. "It was you. And every year since then, every time I heard about someone passing through from Colorado, I asked about you. I learned that you'd settled here, that you're known as a good man, fair in his dealings, that you live alone in the mountains, helping neighbors when needed but keeping to yourself." Dale shifted uncomfortably, unused to hearing his life described so directly. The other diners seemed very far away, though the room was full of the usual evening sounds, clinking plates, murmured conversations, Widow Chen's voice calling orders to the kitchen. "You've made quite a journey," he said finally. "But surely you've had other prospects back in Texas? Younger men with more to offer than a solitary cabin in the highlands?" Hannah's smile held a touch of amusement. "I had offers," she acknowledged. "Good men, some of them. But none of them were you." She reached across the table, her fingers stopping just short of his. "I'm not asking for an answer tonight. Just think about it. I'll be staying here at the boarding house for a while." Dale looked at her hand, resting there on the worn tablecloth. The same hand that had once clutched his coat so trustingly. Now it offered something he'd never allowed himself to hope for. Companionship, understanding, perhaps even love. "I'll think on it," he said quietly, knowing it was the truth. He wouldn't be thinking of much else for a long while. Hannah nodded, seeming satisfied. She stood, smoothing her skirts. "Good night, Dale," she said, then paused. "I'm glad you still look at people the same way, like you see straight to their heart." Dale watched her walk away, her steps as sure as they had been uncertain 20 years ago. The dining room seemed darker after she left, though the lamps burned just as bright. He sat there long after his coffee went cold, remembering a child's solemn vow and a woman's determined eyes. The mountains waited outside, solid and unchanging. But somehow the world felt different than it had that morning. The morning sun painted Redford's main street in shades of gold, the light catching on storefront windows, and the brass handles of hitching posts. Dale walked beside Hannah, conscious of every footstep on the wooden sidewalk. He'd traded his usual buckskins for clean work clothes, though his boots still carried the dust of the mountain trails. Hannah moved with natural grace, her blue calico dress rustling softly. She pointed out details that Dale, despite his years of visits to town, had never truly noticed. The careful stitching on the saloon's curtains, the way morning glories climbed the posts of the telegraph office. "Everything has its own beauty," she said, smiling. "Even the simplest things, if you look close enough." Dale nodded, though his attention was divided between her words and the townsfolk who had begun to gather in small clusters along the street. He caught fragments of whispered conversations, saw the sidelong glances and smirks. "Did you see them? A colored woman, can you imagine? That mountain man's lost his senses." Hannah's steps never faltered, though Dale knew she must hear them too. She held her head high, her bearing as dignified as any lady's. They passed the blacksmith's shop, where two men stopped their work to stare openly, nudging each other with knowing grins. At the general store, the bell above the door chimed as they entered. Mrs. Colton looked up from arranging yard goods, her round face brightening. "Good morning. You must be Miss Hannah. I heard you arrived yesterday." She hurried forward, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm Eleanor Colton. Welcome to Redford." "Thank you, Mrs. Colton," Hannah replied warmly. "Your store is lovely. These fabrics." She ran practiced fingers over a bolt of muslin. "Fine quality." "Oh, you know textiles?" Mrs. Colton's eyes lit up with genuine interest. "I'm a seamstress by trade," Hannah explained, "trained at the mission school in Texas." While the women discussed patterns and stitches, Dale noticed three of the town's so-called leading ladies enter the store. Mrs. Whitaker, wife of the bank owner, made no effort to lower her voice. "Well, I never. Acting like she belongs here, bold as brass." Her companion, Mrs. Parker, sniffed loudly. "And him encouraging it. My Thomas says no good will come of this kind of mixing." The third woman merely curled her lip in obvious disgust. Dale's hand tightened on the counter edge, but before he could speak, Mrs. Colton's clear voice cut through the murmurs. "Ladies, if you're not here to shop, I'm sure you have duties waiting at home. My store welcomes all decent folk, and Miss Hannah has shown herself to be just that." The women retreated, but their poisonous whispers trailed behind them. Dale glanced at Hannah, seeing the tight set of her jaw despite her calm expression. Later that afternoon, Dale led Hannah up the winding trail to his cabin. The mountain air grew cooler as they climbed, heavy with the scent of pine. His home sat in a natural clearing, its log walls weathered to a soft gray. A vegetable garden spread to one side, still yielding late autumn crops. "It's wonderful," Hannah said softly, taking in the swept yard, the neat woodpile, the smoke curling from the stone chimney. "You built this yourself?" Dale nodded, suddenly self-conscious of the cabin's simple furnishings as he showed her inside. "It ain't much, but it keeps out the weather." "It's honest," Hannah said firmly, "like everything else about you." He'd spent the morning preparing, and soon a pot of venison stew simmered over the fire. As darkness gathered outside, they sat at his hand-hewn table, lamplight casting warm shadows on the walls. Hannah spoke of her years after he'd left her at the orphanage. "The sisters were kind," she said, breaking a piece of cornbread. "Sister Mary Catherine taught me to read and write. Sister Elizabeth showed me how to sew, said I had a gift for it." She smiled at the memory. "They encouraged us to learn everything we could." Said knowledge was something no one could take away. "They taught you well," Dale said quietly. "They did." Hannah's eyes grew distant. "But every night I remembered that campfire. The way you listened to a frightened child's promise and treated it with respect." She met his gaze steadily. "I never forgot, Dale. Even when other girls talked about their beaux or made plans for their futures, I knew my path led here." Dale set down his spoon, his heart heavy with concern. "Hannah, you saw how they looked at us today, heard what they said. That's just the beginning of what we'd face." "Yes," she agreed simply. "I saw. I heard. And I'm still here." She reached across the table, her hand covering his. "Fear and ignorance don't change what's true in the heart." Before Dale could respond, a knock sounded at the door. Reverend Harlan stood outside, his black coat dusted with the evening's approaching frost. "Good evening," he said gravely. "I hoped I might find you both here." Dale invited him in, offering coffee. The preacher settled into a chair, studying them both with keen eyes. "Word travels fast in small towns," he said. "I've spent much of today listening to various opinions about your arrival, Miss Hannah." Hannah straightened in her chair. "And what is your opinion, Reverend?" "My opinion," he said slowly, "is that I've never known Dale to act without careful thought, and I've never known a vow before God to be simple coincidence." He sipped his coffee. "Even a child's vow, made in perfect faith, carries the weight of destiny." "Some would say it wasn't proper," Dale said carefully, "a promise made under such circumstances." "Some would say many things," Reverend Harlan interrupted firmly. "The same ones who speak against love while preaching hatred. But I've read my Bible well, and nowhere does it say that God's love stops at the boundaries men create." He set down his cup with purpose. "I came to tell you both, if your hearts are true, if this is God's calling and not merely man's wanting, then I stand ready to marry you. Let the gossips talk. Truth outlasts lies, and love outlasts prejudice." Hannah's eyes shone with unshed tears. "Thank you, Reverend." "Don't thank me yet," he warned kindly. "The path won't be easy." But then, nothing worth doing ever is. He stood, reaching for his hat. "Think on it. Pray on it. I'll be here when you decide." After the preacher left, silence filled the cabin. The lamp flickered, sending shadows dancing across Hannah's face as she gazed into the fire. Dale watched her, seeing both the child she had been and the woman she had become. "It won't be easy," he echoed Reverend Harlan's words. Hannah turned to him, her expression serene, despite the challenges they faced. "No," she agreed, "but we won't face it alone." Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in the darkness, a whippoorwill called. Inside the cabin, two hearts beat steady and sure, strengthened by a promise made long ago and kept through 20 years of faith. The autumn sun painted golden stripes through the cottonwoods along the river. Dale and Hannah walked slowly along the bank, their boots crunching on river stones. The water tumbled past, clear and cold from the mountains, singing its endless song against the rocks. Hannah paused to watch an eagle soar overhead, her face serene in the dappled light. "This reminds me of the creek behind the orphanage," she said softly. "I used to sit there and dream of mountains like these." Dale studied her profile, seeing the strength in her bearing. The past few days had shown him a woman of remarkable grace. She'd faced the town's prejudice with quiet dignity, winning over some with her gentle manner while others remained cold. "Tell me about your dreams now," he said, offering his arm as they navigated a steep part of the bank. She took it, her touch light but sure. "I dream of a home filled with light," she replied, "a garden where I can grow herbs and flowers." Children playing under the aspens. She glanced at him. "A husband who understands that love doesn't see the way others do." Dale's heart tightened in his chest. The vision she painted stirred something deep within him, longing for a life he'd thought forever closed. Yet fear shadowed the warmth. "The path won't be easy," he said, echoing words spoken before. "No," Hannah agreed, "but nothing worth having comes without cost." She stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "Dale, I know you worry. I see how you watch for danger. how careful you are to protect me. But I chose this path with open eyes." He looked down at their joined hands, hers slim and graceful, his weathered and rough. "You deserve better than a life of whispers and sideways looks, than having to prove yourself worthy every day. What I deserve," she said firmly, "is the chance to choose my own path. To love freely, as God intended." Her dark eyes held his. "The question is, will you walk that path with me?" Before Dale could answer, the church bell rang out across the valley, calling the faithful to evening prayers. They made their way back through town, past shuttered shops and lamplit windows. At the church steps, Hannah straightened her skirts and climbed with purpose, head held high despite the stares of those gathering for worship. Inside, the familiar scents of beeswax and pine wrapped around them. They sat near the back, where Dale always preferred. Hannah's voice rose clear and strong during the hymns, her faith unwavering in the face of those who turned to glare. As the service ended and people filed out into the gathering dusk, a man's voice cut through the quiet conversations. "Well, if it ain't the mountain man and his companion." Dale turned slowly. Silas Vance stood at the bottom of the steps, his expensive coat and polished boots marking him as one of the territory's wealthiest ranchers. Two of his men flanked him, hands resting too casually near their gun belts. "Evening, Vance," Dale said evenly, moving slightly in front of Hannah. Vance's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Heard talk you're planning to marry. Seems there might be a problem with that." "No problem I can see," Dale replied, his voice low but firm. "That so?" Vance stepped closer, his gaze fixed on Hannah. "Seems to me there's quite a problem. You see, that girl's mother was indentured to my family. Legal papers and all. By rights, any offspring of hers belongs to me, too, as an unpaid servant." Dale's hand twitched toward his rifle, but Hannah's touch on his arm steadied him. Around them, a crowd began to gather, drawn by the confrontation. "My mother was a free woman," Hannah said clearly, her voice carrying across the churchyard. "She owned her own land, worked her own fields." Vance's laugh was ugly. "That's not what my papers say." "And the law's the law, ain't it? Can't have a servant girl getting above her station marrying whoever she pleases." Dale's vision went red at the edges. "You're lying," he ground out. "Am I?" Vance spread his hands in mock innocence. "Papers don't lie, mountain man, and I aim to present them to the circuit judge when he comes through next week. No preacher in his right mind would perform a marriage with that kind of cloud hanging over it." People whispered in the gathering darkness. Dale saw Mrs. Colton from the store shake her head in disgust at Vance's words, while others nodded as if his claim made perfect sense. "This is nothing but spite," Hannah said, her voice trembling slightly but clear. "You cannot own what God made free." "We'll let the judge decide that." Vance adjusted his coat with deliberate slowness. "Until then, I suggest you remember your place. Wouldn't want any unfortunate incidents while we wait for legal matters to be settled." Dale took a step forward, every muscle tense with rage, but Hannah's grip tightened on his arm. "He's not worth it," she whispered. Vance smirked, touching the brim of his hat in mock courtesy. "Good evening, folks. Sleep well." He turned and walked away, his men following with meaningful glances back at Dale. The crowd dispersed quickly, some muttering about scandal, others speaking Hannah's name with pity. Reverend Harlan stood in the church doorway, his face troubled as he watched them go. "You can't let him do this," Dale said to the preacher. "The law is complex," Reverend Harlan replied heavily. "If he truly has papers—" "Papers can be forged," Hannah said quietly. "Truth can be twisted. But I know who I am. I am free, born of a free woman." Yet Dale saw doubt flicker in her eyes for the first time since her arrival. The confidence that had carried her through days of prejudice wavered in the face of this new threat. They walked back to the boarding house in silence, the stars emerging one by one above the mountains. At the door, Dale took Hannah's hands in his. "Listen to me," he said intently. "No matter what papers he claims to have, no matter what lies he tells, I will stand by you. We'll fight this together." The lamplight from the window caught the sheen of tears in her eyes. "I never thought he could, that anyone could claim." "He can claim what he wants," Dale said firmly. "But your dignity, your freedom, those belong to you alone. I swear by all that's holy I'll help you prove it." Hannah lifted her chin, gathering her strength once more. "My mother used to say that faith lights the darkest path." She squeezed his hands. "Thank you for being my light in this darkness." Dale watched until she was safely inside, then turned toward his cabin. Above him, the stars wheeled in their ancient paths, unchanged by the troubles of those below. But his heart was changed, transformed by love and rage and the fierce determination to protect what was right. The night wind carried the cry of a lone coyote, a sound of defiance against the encroaching dark. Dale squared his shoulders and walked on, knowing that tomorrow would bring new battles, but certain now of the path he had chosen. The morning after Silas's threat, Dale stood at Hannah's boarding house door, his hat in his hands. "It ain't right you staying here with folks whispering behind your back. My cabin's got a spare room. It's yours if you want it." Hannah's eyes widened. "The town will talk even more." "Let them," Dale said firmly. "Better that than leaving you here alone." After a moment's thought, Hannah nodded. "I reckon you're right." She gathered her few belongings, paid the proprietor, and left with her head high despite the pointed stairs. Dale's cabin sat nestled against the pines, smoke curling from its stone chimney. Inside, morning light streamed through small windows, revealing a simple but tidy space. A narrow staircase led to the loft above. "It's not much," Dale said, suddenly aware of every rough-hewn beam and worn floorboard. Hannah touched the solid wooden table, built by Dale's own hands. "It's perfect," she smiled, "though the garden needs attention before frost comes." They fell into an easy rhythm over the next days. Dawn found them sharing coffee by the cook stove, planning the day's tasks. Hannah's skilled hands brought order to the cabin while Dale chopped wood and mended fences. Together they tackled the garden, clearing weeds and harvesting the last vegetables. "My mother taught me about plants," Hannah said one morning, her fingers working the soil. "She said a garden feeds more than the body. It feeds the soul, too." Dale watched her work, remembering the frightened child she'd been, seeing the strong woman she'd become. She was right about that. Their daily trips to the well became a shared ritual. Dale carried the heavy buckets while Hannah sang softly, her voice carrying across the autumn air. Sometimes neighbors passed by, some nodding politely, others turning away. Children followed at a distance, mimicking Hannah's accent with cruel laughs, until Dale's stern look scattered them. But not all hearts were hard. Mrs. Colton from the general store often stopped to chat, sharing news and garden cuttings. Old Joe Walker, who'd lost his arm in the war, touched his hat respectfully when they passed. "Folks forget," he told Dale once, "that kindness don't cost nothing." The real change came when Tommy fell ill. The 10-year-old boy had been among those mocking Hannah. But when fever struck him down, his widowed aunt had nowhere to turn. The doctor was away, and no one else would help. Hannah heard the news and didn't hesitate. "Bring him here," she told the desperate aunt. "I know something about nursing." They carried Tommy to Dale's cabin, his small face flushed with fever. For 3 days and nights, Hannah tended him, cooling his brow with wet cloths, spooning broth between his cracked lips. Dale watched her gentle ways, heard her singing hymns in the dark hours when the boy's fever raged highest. "My mama sang that one," Tommy whispered once, his voice weak but clear. "Sleep now," Hannah murmured, stroking his hair. "God's watching over you." When the fever broke at last, Tommy's aunt wept with gratitude. "I can't never repay you," she said, clutching Hannah's hands. "No need," Hannah replied. "We're neighbors, that's all." Word spread. The same children who had mocked now waved shyly when Hannah passed. Tommy became a frequent visitor, running errands and helping with chores, his fierce loyalty touching them both. One evening, as autumn's chill crept in, Hannah sat by the fire mending clothes. Her voice rose in a familiar hymn, one Dale remembered from long-ago church services. Without thinking, he joined in, his deep bass hesitant at first. Hannah's eyes brightened, but she didn't stop singing. Their voices twined together, filling the cabin with praise. When the song ended, Dale felt something shift inside him, like a door long rusted opening at last. "Been a while since I sang," he admitted. "Forgot how it feels." Hannah set aside her mending. "Faith's like that sometimes. Waiting quiet till we need it most. Reckon I set it aside after finding that settlement." The memory of smoke and violence, of a mother's sacrifice, hung between them. "But you didn't lose it," Hannah said softly. "You showed God's love that day, carrying a scared child to safety." Dale met her eyes across the firelight. "You changed everything, coming back." "God had a purpose," she said, "bringing us both to this place, this time." Her face grew troubled. "If only." "What is it?" Hannah twisted her hands in her lap. "Silas's claim. Without proof my mother was free, he could—" Her voice caught. "The law might believe him." Dale moved to kneel beside her chair. "Listen to me. Your mother died protecting your freedom. No piece of paper can take that from you." "But what if he forges documents?" "What if?" "Then we'll fight him," Dale said firmly. "With truth, with faith, and with every honest person who knows you for who you are." Hannah's fingers found his, holding tight. "I'm scared, Dale. Not of Silas, but of losing this home we're making, these days together." "Won't happen," Dale promised. "Whatever comes, we face it together." They sat in silence then, watching the fires dance, their joined hands a bridge between past and future, fear and hope. Outside, the wind whispered through pine boughs, and somewhere in the darkness an owl called, nature's evensong, joining the hymns still echoing in their hearts. Tommy's small footsteps on the porch announced his arrival with the evening milk. Hannah rose to let him in, her face composed once more, ready to share warmth and welcome with the boy who'd become like family. Dale watched them together, seeing how naturally she mothered the orphaned child, how her strength showed brightest when caring for others. In that moment, he knew with certainty that no matter what schemes Silas Vance might devise, no paper could ever prove stronger than the bonds of love and faith growing in this simple cabin. The truth of Hannah's freedom lived in every kind act, every shared song, every moment of grace she brought to their days together. A week of autumn winds brought golden leaves dancing across Redford's main street. Hannah adjusted her shawl against the morning chill as she and Dale rode their horses toward town. They needed supplies, flour, salt, and coffee. But Hannah's mind dwelled on Silas's threat hanging over them like storm clouds. The general store's bell chimed as they entered. Mrs. Colton greeted them warmly while her husband gathered their supplies. "Mighty fine day for riding," she said, her kind eyes crinkling. "Though I hear tell there's weather coming." Dale nodded, counting out coins on the counter. Hannah wandered to the window, watching townsfolk hurry past. Across the street, the post office door swung open. A thin man in a dark suit, she recognized him as Morton, Silas's clerk, rushed out clutching several envelopes. Something about his hurried manner caught Hannah's attention. He glanced around furtively before heading down the boardwalk. Hannah touched Dale's arm. "I'll meet you at the livery," she whispered. There's something I need to see." Dale's eyes followed her gaze to Morton's retreating figure. He squeezed her hand once, understanding. Hannah slipped out, keeping her distance as she followed Morton. The clerk's polished boots clicked rapidly on the wooden walkway. He passed the saloon, then ducked into the narrow alley beside the bank. Hannah pressed herself against the wall, straining to hear. "Got to get these letters out today," Morton's voice carried. "Mr. Vance wants response as quick as possible about that ledger." A deeper voice responded. The bank manager, Hannah thought. "That old book's caused nothing but trouble. Should have burned it years ago." "Can't now. Too many accounts recorded. Besides, it's locked up safe at the ranch house." Hannah's heart quickened. A ledger, the kind ranchers used to track debts and contracts. If her mother's indenture was recorded there, surely her freedom would be too. She waited until Morton emerged, then hurried back toward the livery. Dale stood beside their horses, his face concerned. "What did you find?" Hannah told him in low tones about the ledger. "If Mama paid her debt, it'll be written there." Dale's weathered face grew thoughtful. "Might be worth having a look at that ranch house." They mounted up, riding slowly out of town. Once past the last buildings, Dale guided them onto a lesser-used trail. "Vance's spread lies west," he said. "Been there once, trading pelts. Big place, but not many hands this time of year." The afternoon sun cast long shadows as they approached Silas's ranch. They dismounted in a grove of cottonwoods, tethering their horses where they couldn't be seen from the house. Dale led Hannah to a rise overlooking the sprawling ranch house. The two-story building dominated the valley, its windows gleaming in the setting sun. A covered porch wrapped around three sides, and smoke rose from two brick chimneys. Near the barn, cowboys were bringing in horses for the night. "Look there," Hannah whispered, pointing. The ranch foreman crossed the yard, a large book tucked under his arm. They watched him climb the porch steps and disappear inside. "That'll be the ledger," Dale said softly. "Ranch books are valuable. Contracts, cattle counts, worker payments. They keep them locked up tight." Hannah's fingers twisted in her skirt. "If we could just see inside." "We will," Dale promised. "But not tonight. Too many eyes about." They retreated as darkness gathered, making their way carefully back to their horses. The ride home was quiet, each lost in thought about what they'd discovered. The cabin welcomed them with warmth and lamplight. Hannah stirred up the fire, while Dale tended to the horses. When he returned, she was kneeling beside her bed, hands clasped in prayer. "Dear Lord," she spoke aloud, her voice trembling but strong, "you brought me back to this place for a purpose. Give us strength for what's ahead. Show us the way to truth." Dale stood silent in the doorway, watching her. The firelight caught the tears on her cheeks, but her face showed determination, not defeat. When she finished, he moved to stand beside her. "We'll find that missing page," he vowed, his deep voice gentle. "Whatever it takes." Hannah rose, wiping her eyes. "I believe we will. God didn't bring us this far to abandon us now." Dale stirred the fire, adding another log. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as they sat together, planning their next move. Outside, an owl called into the darkness, its cry echoing across the valley toward Silas's ranch, where the ledger waited, holding secrets that could change everything. "Tomorrow," Dale said, "we start watching the ranch house proper. Learn their routines. When the time's right." He let the words hang. Hannah nodded, her face set with purpose. "When the time's right, we'll know. And we'll be ready." The fire crackled between them, its warmth a comfort against the autumn night. In its glow, hope flickered like a newly kindled flame, small but growing stronger with each passing moment. Dawn painted the Colorado mountains in shades of rose and gold. Dale stood on his cabin's porch, scanning the valley below while coffee bubbled on the iron stove inside. Hannah hummed softly as she kneaded dough for morning biscuits, the familiar routine bringing comfort after yesterday's discovery at Silas's ranch. The crunch of leaves drew Dale's attention. Through the morning mist, a figure approached, an elderly woman wrapped in a wool blanket, her silver hair braided traditionally. She carried a cloth-wrapped bundle. "White Dove," Dale called respectfully, recognizing the Ute elder. He descended the porch steps to greet her. Hannah appeared in the doorway, wiping flour from her hands. White Dove's dark eyes studied her intently, a gentle smile spreading across her weathered face. "I bring thanks," White Dove said, her voice rich with age and wisdom. She unwrapped the bundle, revealing fresh venison. "My grandson's first hunt. We share with friends." Dale accepted the gift with a slight bow. "Much obliged. Won't you join us for coffee?" Inside the cabin, Hannah poured steaming coffee into tin cups, while White Dove settled near the hearth. The elder's gaze never left Hannah's face. "You have your mother's eyes," White Dove said suddenly. "Strong eyes. Kind eyes." Hannah's hands trembled slightly as she set down the coffee pot. You knew my mother?" White Dove nodded slowly. "Many winters ago. Bad year. Game was scarce, crops failed. Your mother shared cornmeal, dried beans when my people had little. Said no child should go hungry, no matter their people." She touched the venison bundle. "We remember such kindness." Tears welled in Hannah's eyes. Dale moved closer, his presence steady and protective. "The whole settlement was like that," Hannah said softly, "before the raiders came." White Dove's expression grew grave. "I have heard talk in town. Silas Vance claims old bonds." She spat the name like something bitter. "That man's words are like smoke. They twist, they hide truth." Dale's jaw tightened. "You know something about Vance?" The elder stared into the fire, memories dancing in her eyes. 3 summers past, I traded at his ranch, saw him in his study, angry about some paper. He tore a page from Big Book, threw it in fire." She looked directly at Hannah. "Page had marks, numbers, like those white men used to track debts." Hannah gasped softly. Dale's hands clenched into fists. "You believe that page?" Hannah couldn't finish. White Dove nodded. "Many secrets in that book. Many papers burned when truth threatens Vance's power." She reached out, taking Hannah's hand in her weathered one. "But truth lives in memory. Your mother's kindness is remembered. Her freedom was earned. This I know." Hannah squeezed the elder's hand, tears flowing freely now. "Thank you," she whispered, "for remembering, for telling me." The morning passed in quiet conversation. White Dove shared stories of Hannah's mother, her generosity, her courage, her deep faith. Each word was a precious gift, filling empty spaces in Hannah's heart. As the sun climbed higher, White Dove rose to leave. At the door, she turned to Dale. "Watch close," she warned. "Vance is like wounded bear, most dangerous when cornered." Her eyes softened as she looked at Hannah. "But you have strong protector. And Creator watches over you both." They watched the elder disappear into the trees. Hannah wiped her eyes with her apron. "I never thought, after all these years." Dale wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Your mama raised you right, taught you to see past differences, help those in need." "Like you did," Hannah said quietly, taking in a frightened orphan girl. The day turned toward evening, bringing clouds and a chill wind. Dale built up the fire while Hannah prepared a simple supper. The venison would keep for tomorrow's meal. As darkness gathered, boots sounded on the porch. Reverend Harlan entered, stamping trail dust from his feet. "Thought I'd check on you both," he said, accepting a cup of coffee. Town's buzzing with talk about Vance's claim. Dale related White Dove's story about the burned ledger page. The preacher's face grew stern. Destroying evidence is a grave sin, he said, but proving it won't be easy. He studied their faces. We must have patience. Trust in God's timing. Patience? Dale's voice was rough. While Vance threatens Hannah's freedom? He stood abruptly, moving to where his rifle hung above the mantel. With sharp movements, he began cleaning the weapon. Violence won't solve this, Reverend Harlan cautioned. It'll only give Vance more power. Dale's hands didn't stop their work. Sometimes a man has to stand up to evil. Hannah rose from her chair, crossing to Dale's side. Gently, she laid her hand over his, where it gripped the rifle. Remember your promise, she said softly. To protect me, yes, but not with bullets. Dale's movement stilled. He looked into her eyes, seeing the same quiet strength White Dove had mentioned. You were just a child then, he said roughly. Didn't know what you were asking. I knew enough, Hannah replied. Knew you were a good man. Still are. Her fingers tightened on his. We'll find another way. Through prayer and patience, like Reverend says. Slowly, Dale's grip on the rifle loosened. He returned it to its hooks, though his face remained troubled. Reverend Harlan watched the exchange with approval. God's justice moves in its own time, he said. Our task is to keep faith, stay strong together. As the preacher prepared to leave, he blessed them both. Keep watching, he advised. Keep praying. Truth has a way of coming to light. In the quiet after his departure, Dale and Hannah sat before the fire. The wind whispered around the cabin's corners, carrying the first hint of winter. White Dove's words were a gift, Hannah said finally. Knowing Mama is remembered that way. Dale nodded. Memory carries power. Maybe more than burnt papers. Hannah leaned against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. We'll find a way, she said. Without violence. Without hatred. Dale's arm circled her shoulders, protective yet gentle. Outside, clouds parted, revealing stars scattered like diamonds across the mountain sky. Each one seemed to whisper of hope, of justice, of faith rewarded in God's own time. The first snow of winter drifted down from pearl-gray skies, dusting the Colorado mountains in white. Dale stood at his woodpile, the axe rising and falling in steady rhythm. Each stroke sent chips flying as he split another log for the growing stack beside the cabin. The morning air bit cold and crisp, his breath forming clouds with every swing. Inside, Hannah stirred a pot of beans on the iron stove, adding pinches of dried herbs she'd gathered during autumn. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and baking bread, warm against the gathering chill. Through the window, she watched Dale work, his movements sure and strong. A smile touched her lips as she remembered their quiet breakfast together, how naturally they'd fallen into sharing daily tasks. The axe thudded one final time, and Dale gathered an armload of split wood. Hannah opened the door as he approached, letting him stack the logs in the box beside the hearth. Storm's coming, he said, brushing snow from his coat. Might last a few days. Hannah nodded, ladling beans into 2 bowls. We're well prepared. I counted our stores yesterday. Plenty of flour, salt pork, dried vegetables. You think like a mountain woman already, Dale said softly, the compliment warming her more than the fire. After the meal, Hannah settled at the table to read her morning mail while Dale mended a pair of leather work gloves. A letter caught her eye, familiar handwriting from her friend Sarah, a missionary in Denver. Her fingers traced the careful script as she read. Dearest Hannah, news of your trials has reached us here. Remember that faith, like a seed in winter ground, requires patience to bloom. The Lord tests our endurance that we might grow stronger. You are daily in our prayers. Tears pricked Hannah's eyes as she continued reading Sarah's words of encouragement. The letter spoke of hope, of standing firm in faith despite opposition. It reminded her that love, when blessed by God, could overcome any barrier. Dale glanced up from his work, noting her expression. Good news? A reminder, Hannah said, carefully folding the letter, that we're not alone in this struggle. She smiled at him across the table. And that some things are worth waiting for. As evening settled over the mountains, the snow fell thicker. Dale built up the fire while Hannah mixed cornmeal and water for bread. The familiar motions of cooking brought comfort, and soon the cabin filled with the sweet scent of baking cornbread. They sat before the hearth to share their simple supper, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Hannah broke the cornbread, still warm, and passed half to Dale. I've been thinking, she said carefully, watching his face. About the wedding. Dale's hands stilled. Even with Silas's threats? Hannah's chin lifted. Especially because of them. We can't let fear rule our hearts. She reached across and touched his rough hand. God brought me back to you for a reason. Dale was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. All these years, I kept my distance from folks, from faith, too. He turned his hand to clasp hers. But having you here, it's like spring after a long winter. Makes me believe in things I'd forgotten. Then let's not wait, Hannah said softly. Let's plan our ceremony. Show the town that love and faith still matter more than hate. Dale's eyes met hers, warm with tenderness. You sure about this? Won't be easy. I've never been more sure, Hannah replied. We'll need Reverend Harlan's help, of course. The next morning, they made their way through the snow to the Reverend's small church. He listened to their request with growing joy. About time, he said, smiling broadly. I've been praying you'd come to this decision. He grew more serious. There will be opposition, you know. Silas won't take this quietly. We know, Dale said firmly, but we're ready to face whatever comes. The Reverend nodded approvingly. Then I'd be honored to officiate. And you might be surprised. Not everyone shares Silas's views. He was right. As word spread through town, several families came forward with offers of help. Mrs. Colton from the general store promised to donate white ribbon. The widow Thompson, whose son Hannah had nursed, offered her best tablecloth for the altar. Even the baker's wife volunteered to make a small wedding cake. That evening, Dale sat alone in his workshop, a piece of pine wood in his hands. By lantern light, his knife moved carefully, shaping the wood into a circle. He worked slowly, methodically, smoothing the simple band that would be Hannah's ring. No store-bought gold could mean more than this token carved from the mountains that had sheltered them both. Hannah found him there, carrying a cup of coffee. She watched silently as he worked, understanding the devotion in every careful stroke of the knife. It's perfect, she whispered when he held it up to the light. Dale's eyes crinkled at the corners. Not finished yet. Needs more smoothing. He tucked the ring carefully into his shirt pocket. But it'll be ready when the time comes? They walked back to the cabin together through the softly falling snow. The mountain night was crystal clear, stars burning bright above the white-draped pines. Hannah's heart felt as full as the moon that hung like a silver lamp in the sky. Inside, they added wood to the banked fire, bringing warmth back to the room. Hannah brought out her mother's Bible, its pages worn with years of faithful reading. I've marked some verses, she said, for the ceremony. She began to read, her voice gentle in the firelit quiet. Love is patient, love is kind. Dale listened, his face softened by the familiar words. When she finished, he took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. Never thought I'd have this, he said roughly. A home. A family. Someone to share God's word with. Hannah squeezed his hand. He had a plan all along. Even when I was that scared little girl under the wagon. Even then, Dale agreed. Reckon he knows better than we do what our hearts need. Outside, the snow continued to fall, building drifts against the cabin walls. But inside, warmth bloomed like summer flowers. Hannah and Dale sat together before the fire, planning their future with hearts full of hope, their faith stronger than any storm that might come. The wooden ring in Dale's pocket was a promise, not just of marriage, but of a love that could endure. Like the mountains themselves, it would stand firm against whatever trials lay ahead, rooted in faith, strengthened by devotion, blessed by God's eternal grace. The January morning dawned crisp and clear as Dale loaded lumber into his wagon. The church needed benches for the growing number of well-wishers, and his skilled hands would build them. The fresh-cut pine boards released their sweet scent as he worked, his saw rhythmically cutting through wood, while frost sparkled on the ground. Inside the church, Reverend Harlan watched Dale's progress through the window. The Lord works in mysterious ways, he mused, helping Dale carry the first completed bench inside. Who would have thought a wedding would bring so many folks together? Dale just nodded, already planning the next bench. His thoughts drifted to Hannah, who was at that moment sitting by lamplight in Mrs. Thompson's front parlor, working on her wedding dress. The widow had offered her sewing machine and a quiet space away from prying eyes. Hannah's fingers moved steadily, guiding white cotton fabric through the machine. She had chosen a simple pattern that suited both her taste and her means. Careful tucks and tiny pleats would make it special. As she worked, she hummed old hymns. Amazing Grace, Be Thou My Vision, songs that had sustained her through years of waiting. It's coming along beautifully, Mrs. Thompson said, bringing Hannah a cup of tea. Though I still say you should have let me contribute some lace. Hannah smiled, touching the fabric softly. This is perfect just as it is. Plain and true, like our love. Outside, Tommy darted through the streets, his thin legs carrying him from house to house. The 10-year-old boy clutched a stack of handwritten invitations, taking his role as wedding messenger with solemn importance. At each door, he stood straight-backed, delivering the invitations with careful dignity. Miss Hannah and Mr. Dale are getting married, he announced proudly to each recipient. Saturday next at the church. Reverend Harlan says all good Christians are welcome. Some doors closed quickly, but others opened wide. Mrs. Colton at the general store not only accepted her invitation, but gave Tommy a stick of candy. You tell Hannah I'll bring enough ribbon to decorate every window, she promised. The baker's wife, Mrs. Sullivan, read her invitation twice. Well, she said slowly, I reckon love is love. And my wedding cake recipe never failed to bring joy yet. As the days passed, more townspeople began stopping by the church to watch Dale work. They saw his careful measuring, his precise cuts, the way he sanded each bench until it was smooth as silk. They witnessed his quiet dedication, and something in their hearts softened. Man builds like that, old Mr. Peterson observed to his wife. He builds for forever. Maybe there's something to this match after all. The evening before the wedding, Dale hitched his horses to the sleigh he had borrowed from his nearest neighbor. The runners gleamed, freshly polished, and warm blankets lined the seat. He drove to Hannah's temporary lodgings at Mrs. Thompson's house, his heart beating faster at the sight of her waiting on the porch. Hannah's eyes sparkled as Dale helped her into the sleigh. He tucked the blankets around her carefully, then clucked to the horses. They moved forward with a gentle jingling of harness bells, gliding over the snow-covered road that led out of town. The evening was perfect for a sleigh ride. Stars began appearing in the darkening sky, and their breath made soft clouds in the cold air. The horses' hooves made a muffled rhythm in the snow as Dale guided them toward the open meadows. I remember the first time I saw these mountains, Hannah said softly. "The day you brought me to the orphanage. They seemed so big, so permanent, like God's own promise written in stone." Dale's hand found hers beneath the blanket. "Been waiting here all this time, just like me." His voice grew husky. "Hannah, I promise you this. Every day of my life, I'll work to deserve the trust you placed in me. To be worthy of that little girl's faith." Hannah's eyes filled with tears of joy. She lifted her face to the star-filled sky and prayed aloud. "Thank you, Lord, for your faithfulness, for keeping your promise when mine was just a child's words, for bringing us back together in your perfect time." The sleigh glided through moonlit meadows, the runners making soft, swooshing sounds through the pristine snow. Dale and Hannah sat close, sharing warmth and dreams of their future, while the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. Morning came early on the wedding day. The sun rose into a cloudless sky, making the snow-covered mountains glow pink and gold. Before dawn, townsfolk were already gathering at the church, stamping snow from their boots, their breath visible in the cold air. Inside, Dale stood before the small mirror in the church's back room, struggling with his tie. His best shirt, pressed crisp and white, felt stiff around his neck. His normally steady hands trembled slightly as he tried again to make the knot lie straight. Reverend Harlan appeared in the doorway. "Here, let me help with that." His experienced fingers quickly put the tie to rights. "There now. Ready to meet your bride?" Dale swallowed hard and nodded. "Been ready 20 years, he said gruffly. The church filled quickly. The new benches Dale had built gleamed with fresh varnish, solid and welcoming. White ribbons decorated the windows, and winter greenery graced the altar. The morning sun streamed through the windows, making rainbow patterns on the wooden floor. Tommy, wearing his Sunday best, proudly escorted people to their seats. His aunt had polished his shoes until they shone, and his normally unruly hair had been tamed with water. He performed his duties with a grave face, though his eyes danced with excitement. At Mrs. Thompson's house, Hannah stood before another mirror, hardly recognizing herself. Her wedding dress was everything she had dreamed, simple yet elegant, with tiny tucks and pleats that caught the light. Her dark skin glowed with happiness, and her eyes shone with joyful tears. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Thompson said softly, adjusting Hannah's collar, "like a bride should look." Hannah touched the dress one last time, smoothing an invisible wrinkle. "It's time," she whispered. The small church was full when Hannah arrived. She paused in the entrance, her heart swelling at the sight of so many familiar faces. Mrs. Colton dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. The baker's wife smiled encouragingly. Even old Mr. Peterson nodded respectfully. The piano began to play, Mrs. Thompson's daughter at the keys, her fingers sure on the familiar wedding march. Dale turned from his place by the altar, and his face transformed at the sight of Hannah. She walked slowly down the aisle, her simple bouquet of winter evergreens and dried flowers trembling slightly in her hands. Her handmade dress whispered against the wooden floor, and her eyes never left Dale's face. When she reached him, Dale took her hand in his. They turned together to face Reverend Harlan, their fingers intertwined, their hearts beating as one. The morning sun streamed through the windows, surrounding them in golden light. The church grew quiet. Reverend Harlan opened his Bible, his voice strong and clear in the hushed sanctuary. Dale's hand tightened on Hannah's as they stood together before God and their neighbors, ready to speak the vows that would bind their lives forever. For one perfect, shining moment, everything was as it should be. The 20-year-old promise of a frightened child had led them here, to this altar, to this gathering of witnesses, to this holy confirmation of love's enduring power. The morning sunlight streamed through the church windows, casting rainbow patterns across Hannah's white dress. Reverend Harlan's weathered Bible lay open in his hands as he smiled at the couple before him. Dale's rough fingers trembled slightly as they held Hannah's delicate ones. The congregation sat in reverent silence, waiting for the ceremony to begin. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Harlan began, his deep voice filling the small church, "we are gathered here today in the sight of God." The heavy wooden doors crashed open with a thunderous bang. Winter wind howled through the church, scattering the evergreen decorations. Silas Vance strode down the aisle, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Behind him, 4 armed men filed in, their hands resting on their holsters. Women gasped. Children shrank against their mothers. "This wedding stops now," Silas announced, his voice cutting through the shocked silence. He pulled a sheaf of papers from his coat and slammed them onto the pulpit. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the sacred space. "These documents prove that Hannah's mother died still owing a considerable debt to my family," Silas declared, jabbing his finger at the papers. "By law, that debt passes to her daughter. Hannah remains bound in service until that debt is paid." Dale's hand moved instinctively to his holster. His face darkened with fury as he took a half step forward. But Hannah's fingers tightened on his arm, her eyes pleading. "Please," she whispered, "not here." "Not like this." Reverend Harlan carefully set down his Bible and picked up the papers. His eyes narrowed as he studied them in the morning light. The congregation held its breath, the only sound the crackle of paper and the wind whistling through the open door. "These appear to be legally filed," the preacher said slowly, his voice heavy with sadness. "While their truth may be questionable, they must be properly challenged in court." He turned to Dale and Hannah, his eyes full of pain. "I cannot proceed with this ceremony while such a claim stands unchallenged. There can be no blood shed in God's house." "No!" Dale's voice was rough with emotion. "You can't let him." "Take her!" Silas ordered his men. 2 of them moved forward, their spurs jingling on the wooden floor. Hannah stood straight and proud, though tears streamed down her face. "Dale," she said softly, "remember your promise. No violence. Please." Dale's whole body trembled with rage as Silas's men grabbed Hannah's arms. Her simple bouquet fell to the floor, evergreen sprigs scattering across the boards. Mrs. Colton began to sob quietly. Tommy, the orphan boy, buried his face in his aunt's skirts. "Step aside," Silas commanded Dale, his hand on his own pistol. For a moment, Dale stood frozen, his face a mask of agony. Then, slowly, remembering Hannah's words, he moved away from the altar. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as he watched Silas's men drag Hannah toward the door, her white dress catching on the rough wooden benches. The congregation sat paralyzed, faces pale with fear and shame. No one moved to help. No one spoke a word. Even Reverend Harlan stood silent, the forged papers trembling in his hands. "She belongs to me now," Silas announced to the stunned church. "Anyone who interferes will answer to the law." He smiled coldly at Dale. "And to my guns." Hannah's voice rang out clear and strong as they pulled her through the door. "I love you, Dale. Keep faith." Then she was gone. The heavy doors slammed shut behind them. Outside, horses' hooves thundered away through the snow, taking Hannah to Silas's ranch house. Dale stood alone at the altar, his wedding ring of carved wood falling from his numb fingers. It rolled across the floor, coming to rest against Hannah's scattered flowers. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, but now its light seemed cold and cruel. One by one, the townspeople filed out of the church, heads bowed, unable to meet Dale's eyes. Soon only Reverend Harlan remained, standing beside the mountain man in the empty church. "I am so sorry," the preacher said softly, "but we must trust in God's—" "Don't," Dale cut him off, his voice raw. "Just don't." He turned and walked slowly down the aisle, his footsteps hollow in the silence. At the door, he paused and looked back at the altar where his dreams had shattered. Then he stepped out into the bitter winter morning. The sun was setting when Dale finally returned to his cabin. The house felt empty, haunted by memories of Hannah's presence, her hymns by the fire, her laughter at the table, her prayers in the evening. The wedding dress she had sewn still lay across the chair where she had worked on it, the needle stuck in the fabric waiting for final adjustments that would never come. Dale's hands shook as he built a fire in the hearth. The flames caught quickly, but their warmth couldn't touch the cold emptiness in his heart. He could picture Hannah locked away in Silas's grand ranch house, surrounded by armed guards, her white dress soiled from rough handling. His rifle hung on the wall, cleaned and loaded, tempting him with quick vengeance. But Hannah's words echoed in his mind. Remember your promise. No violence, even now, a prisoner, she was trying to save his soul. The fire crackled and popped as Dale sank to his knees beside the hearth, his hands clasped together so tight his knuckles turned white. For 20 years, he had lived by his rifle and his own strength. Now, with everything he loved at stake, those tools were useless. Lord, he whispered, his voice breaking, I ain't much for praying. But Hannah believes in you. She sees your hand in everything. He paused, struggling for words. I don't know how to fight this without violence. I don't know how to save her. Please, please, show me the way. Tears fell from his weathered face onto his clasped hands as he knelt there in the firelight. Outside, the wind howled through the mountain peaks, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote cried, lonely, lost, and longing for its mate. The winter dawn broke cold and gray over the mountains. Dale sat at his cabin table, staring at Hannah's empty chair, when a soft knock at the door startled him from his grief. Opening it, he found White Dove standing in the early morning shadows, snow dusting her dark shawl. May I enter? She asked quietly. Her eyes held a spark of urgency that made Dale step back, gesturing her inside. The elderly Ute woman moved carefully to the fire, warming her hands. Steam rose from her damp clothes as the snow melted. For several moments she said nothing, studying Dale's face in the firelight. You have not slept, she observed finally. Dale shook his head. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his shoulders sagged with exhaustion. Can't rest while Hannah's held captive. White Dove nodded slowly, reaching into the folds of her shawl. The Creator guides our steps, even in darkness. Her weathered hands withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and torn along one edge. Last night, while Silas's men drank and boasted, I searched his barn. Dale's heart began to pound as she carefully unfolded the document. The paper was clearly torn from a ledger, the neat columns of numbers and dates still visible despite age spots and creases. Look here, White Dove said, pointing to an entry dated 20 years ago. Hannah's mother's name, and beside it. Paid in full, Dale whispered, his voice rough with emotion. His hands trembled as he read the clear notation. All debts settled through labor and trade, released from service with honors. The signature below was unmistakably that of Silas's father. This is why Silas tore it out, White Dove explained. He hid it in the barn loft, wrapped in oilcloth, thinking none would dare search there. But I have watched his ways for many seasons. I knew he would keep such proof close. Dale's eyes filled with tears as he gripped the precious document. White Dove, I can't thank you enough. She smiled gently. Thank me by bringing justice. Hannah's mother showed kindness to my people when others turned away. Now we repay that debt. Dale carefully tucked the ledger page into his shirt. I need witnesses. People who can testify this came from Silas's own records. I will speak truth, White Dove assured him, and others will join us. The town's heart is not as hard as Silas believes. Dale grabbed his coat, hope driving him to action. The territorial judge arrives next week for winter court. With this proof and enough witnesses. Go, White Dove urged. Gather those who will stand for right. Dale saddled his horse quickly, the morning air bitter cold against his face. The snow had stopped, leaving the world hushed and white. As he rode toward town, the sun began breaking through the clouds, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold. His first stop was the church, where he found Reverend Harlan already awake and tending the stove. The preacher's eyes widened as Dale spread the ledger page carefully on his desk. "Good Lord above," Reverend Harlan breathed, studying the document. "This is exactly what we needed." Silas's own family records, proving Hannah's freedom. He looked up at Dale. "Where did you get this?" Dale explained White Dove's discovery. The preacher nodded slowly, his expression growing determined. "I'll testify to its authenticity. And I know others who will stand with us." Together they rode to Tommy's aunt's house on the edge of town. The widow answered their knock, still wearing her apron, flour on her hands from morning baking. When they showed her the document, tears filled her eyes. "Hannah nursed my Tommy through fever without asking anything in return," she said firmly. "I'll gladly tell the judge what I know of Silas's schemes." Throughout the morning, Dale and Reverend Harlan visited other townspeople who had shown kindness to Hannah. Mrs. Colton from the general store, the blacksmith who had helped repair Dale's cabin roof, the schoolteacher who had admired Hannah's fine stitching. One by one, they agreed to testify about Silas's threats and Hannah's good character. "The territorial judge is strict but fair," Reverend Harlan explained as they rode back toward the church. "With this document and these witnesses, Silas's false claims won't stand." Dale touched the precious paper through his shirt. "How much longer until the judge arrives?" 6 days, the preacher replied. "The winter sessions always start the first Tuesday of December." He glanced at Dale's worried expression. "I know it seems long, but Hannah is strong in faith. She'll endure." Dale reined his horse to a stop, gazing toward Silas's distant ranch. Somewhere in that grand house, Hannah waited, not knowing help was coming. His hands tightened on the reins. "I should just ride out there now," he said roughly. "Show Silas this proof and demand—" "No," Reverend Harlan cut him off firmly. "Silas is dangerous when cornered. If he destroyed this evidence once, he'd do worse now. We must wait for proper justice." Dale knew the preacher was right, but the thought of Hannah spending 6 more nights as Silas's prisoner made his chest ache. Still, she had asked him to avoid violence. He would honor that request, no matter the cost. As evening approached, Dale returned to his cabin. White Dove had left, but traces of her presence remained. Healing herbs hanging by the fire, a small medicine pouch on the table. He carefully removed the ledger page from his shirt and wrapped it in clean cloth, hiding it in a secure place beneath the floorboards. The cabin felt less empty now that hope had taken root. Dale built up the fire and knelt beside it, just as he had the night before. But this time, his prayers came easier. "Lord," he whispered, "thank you for sending help through White Dove. Thank you for showing us a path that don't need violence." He paused, emotion thick in his throat. "Please give Hannah strength for these last few days. Help her feel your presence, even in that dark place." Miles away, in a locked room of Silas's ranch house, Hannah sat in the window seat, watching the same stars emerge above the snowy peaks. Her wedding dress lay crumpled in the corner where she had been forced to change into a servant's clothes. But they couldn't make her wear the shackles of fear. She sang softly to herself, her clear voice carrying the words of an old hymn into the winter night. "Be not dismayed whate'er betide, God will take care of you." The guards outside her door shifted uncomfortably, for even they could not help being moved by the pure faith in her voice. Hannah smiled slightly and kept singing, her spirit unbroken. She didn't know that rescue was already in motion, but she believed with all her heart that God would make a way. Snow began falling again, thick white flakes drifting past her window. They seemed to dance in rhythm with her quiet song, as though nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for justice to unfold. In the crystalline silence of that winter night, Hope bloomed like flowers beneath the snow, delicate but unstoppable in its appointed time. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and cold, frost etching delicate patterns on the town hall's windows. Inside, lamps burned against the winter gloom as townspeople filed in, stamping snow from their boots and speaking in hushed voices. The territorial judge, a silver-haired man named Harrison, sat behind a broad oak desk, his stern face betraying nothing as he arranged his papers. Dale sat near the front, his throat tight with tension. Reverend Harlan placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. Behind them, White Dove sat wrapped in a wool blanket, her dark eyes alert and watchful. Other witnesses, Mrs. Colton, Tommy's aunt, the schoolteacher, filled the nearby benches. The door swung open, letting in a blast of cold air. Silas Vance strode in, flanked by two expensive-looking lawyers from Denver. Their polished boots and fine coats stood in sharp contrast to the townspeople's simple dress. Silas caught Dale's eye and smirked, clearly confident in his position. "All rise," called the bailiff. "This territorial court is now in session, the Honorable Judge Harrison presiding." The judge's voice cut through the murmurs. "We are here to settle the matter of claimed indenture regarding Miss Hannah Mitchell. Mr. Vance, you assert rights of service over this woman based on a prior agreement with her deceased mother. Present your evidence." Silas's primary lawyer stepped forward, producing several documents. "Your Honor, these papers clearly show the original terms of indenture, signed 20 years ago. No record exists of their fulfillment." Judge Harrison examined the papers carefully, while Dale's heart hammered in his chest. This was the moment they had waited for. "Your Honor," Dale's voice was steady as he stood, "we have evidence that proves those claims false." The judge peered at him over his spectacles. "Approach." Dale walked forward, carefully withdrawing the torn ledger page from inside his coat. White Dove rose and followed him, her steps measured and dignified. "This page was torn from Silas Vance's own account books," Dale explained, laying it on the judge's desk. "It shows Hannah's mother's indenture was paid in full, with her release signed by Silas's own father." A sharp intake of breath from Silas's direction. The judge lifted the page, studying it intently in the lamplight. His fingers traced the torn edge, then moved to examine the handwriting. "Where did you obtain this document?" he asked. White Dove stepped forward. "I found it hidden in his barn loft, wrapped in oilcloth." Her voice carried clearly through the hall. "I saw him tear it from his books years ago, when he first planned to claim the girl. He thought no one was watching, but our people have learned to watch carefully." Silas surged to his feet. "This is absurd." "You're believing the word of a savage over." "Mind your tongue in my courtroom," Judge Harrison snapped. "This witness will be treated with respect." He turned to White Dove. "Please continue." She described finding the hidden page, her words simple and direct. The judge nodded slowly, then called for Silas's ledger books to be brought forward. One of the lawyers produced them reluctantly. "Bailiff, please summon Mr. Jenkins, the foreman," the judge ordered. A weather-beaten man in ranch clothes entered, twisting his hat nervously. After swearing him in, the judge held up the torn page. "Do you recognize this document?" Jenkins swallowed hard, glancing at his employer. Silas's face had gone pale with rage. "Tell the truth," the judge commanded. "You're under oath." "Yes, sir," Jenkins finally said, his voice rough. I saw Mr. Vance tear it out, back in '73. Said he needed to protect his interests, on account of the girl might come back someday." A low murmur swept through the hall. Silas's lawyers whispered urgently to him, but he shoved them away, his face mottled with fury. Judge Harrison spent several minutes comparing the torn page to Silas's ledger, examining the paper, ink, and handwriting. Finally, he set both down with deliberate care. "The evidence is conclusive," he declared. "This page is authentic, torn from Mr. Vance's own records. It proves beyond any doubt that the indenture in question was fully satisfied." His voice hardened. Furthermore, the deliberate concealment of this document constitutes fraud. Dale's heart leapt. Beside him, Reverend Harlan whispered a prayer of thanks. I hereby rule that Miss Hannah Mitchell is and has always been a free woman, the judge continued. Any claim of indenture against her is null and void. He turned his stern gaze to Silas. Mr. Vance, you are fined $500 for attempting to defraud this court. Additionally, you are stripped of your position on the Territorial Council and barred from holding any office of public trust. Silas's face went from red to white. You can't. I can and I have, Judge Harrison cut him off. Be grateful I'm not pursuing criminal charges for attempted enslavement. Bailiff, please escort Mr. Vance and his lawyers out. As Silas was led away, the judge turned to Dale. Where is Miss Mitchell now? Under guard at Vance's ranch, Your Honor. Bailiff, send the sheriff to fetch her immediately. The next half hour seemed endless to Dale. The townspeople stayed in their seats, talking quietly among themselves. Many who had previously shunned Hannah now looked ashamed, avoiding Dale's eyes. White Dove sat serenely, accepting thanks from those who came to acknowledge her role in revealing the truth. Finally, the door opened. Hannah stood there, escorted by the sheriff. She wore the same servant's dress Silas had forced upon her, but she held herself with unwavering dignity. Her eyes found Dale's instantly. Dale rushed forward as Hannah ran to him. They met in the middle of the hall, Hannah collapsing into his arms with a sob of relief. Dale held her tightly, his own tears falling into her hair. You're free, he whispered. Truly free. I knew God would make a way, she breathed. The hall erupted in cheers and applause. Even Judge Harrison smiled slightly. Reverend Harlan approached them, his own eyes moist. The Lord's justice prevails, he said softly. Hannah turned to White Dove, who had come to stand beside them. The two women embraced, transcending the barriers of race and culture that had too long divided the territory. Thank you, Hannah whispered, for remembering my mother's kindness and repaying it so generously. A good heart's debt never fades, White Dove replied, touching Hannah's cheek gently. Mrs. Colton pushed forward through the crowd. Hannah, dear, you must come stay with us until the wedding. No more of that dreadful boarding house. Others joined in, offering congratulations and support. The same townspeople who had once whispered behind their hands now spoke warmly, asking forgiveness for their earlier prejudice. Hannah accepted their words graciously, her natural kindness shining through despite all she had endured. Dale kept his arm around her, still hardly daring to believe it was over. Through the windows, he could see fresh snow beginning to fall, as though nature itself was celebrating by laying down a clean white blanket over the sins of the past. Judge Harrison gathered his papers, pausing as he passed them. Miss Mitchell, Mr. Blackwood, I wish you every happiness. Your faith in justice and in each other does credit to this territory. Hannah smiled through her tears. Thank you, Your Honor, for hearing the truth. The judge nodded gravely and departed. As the townspeople began to disperse, Dale looked down at Hannah's radiant face. Her eyes shone with joy and relief, reflecting the lamplight like stars. Shall we set a new wedding date? He asked softly. Hannah's smile lit up the whole hall. I reckon we've waited long enough. The winter sun had set early, but warmth and light spilled from every window of the little church. Lanterns hung from posts along the path, their golden glow reflecting off the fresh snow. Inside, the wooden pews gleamed with polish, and evergreen boughs decorated the walls, filling the air with their sweet scent. Townspeople filed in, dressed in their finest clothes. Even those who had once turned away now came with open hearts, chastened by the morning's revelations. Mrs. Colton fussed over the flowers at the altar, while Tommy and his aunt scattered pine needles down the aisle, making it fragrant with each step. In the small back room, Hannah stood before a mirror, smoothing her wedding dress. She had feared it would be wrinkled from its days of storage during her captivity, but Mrs. Colton had pressed it lovingly that afternoon. The white fabric shimmered in the lamplight, every stitch sewn by Hannah's own hands speaking of hope and patience. "You look like an angel," White Dove said softly, adjusting Hannah's veil. The elderly woman had wrapped a beautiful beaded shawl around Hannah's shoulders, a gift she said had been waiting 20 years to be given. In the opposite room, Dale fumbled with his tie, his weathered hands trembling slightly. Reverend Harlan stepped in to help, his experienced fingers making quick work of the stubborn knot. "Steady now," the preacher said with a gentle smile. "The Lord's timing is perfect, even when we don't understand the waiting." Dale nodded, touching the wooden ring in his pocket. He had carved it from mountain pine, polishing it until it shone like satin. Simple, like their life would be, but strong and true as his love for Hannah. The church bell rang out across the snow-covered valley, calling everyone to witness. Reverend Harlan took his place at the altar, his Bible open to the passage about love being patient and kind. The congregation settled into their seats, an air of anticipation filling the small space. Dale walked to the front, his back straight, his eyes clear. This time there would be no interruption, no threat to tear them apart. He watched as Tommy's aunt began playing the old pump organ, its deep notes resonating through the wooden walls. The doors opened, and Hannah appeared in the warm lamplight. A collective breath of awe swept through the church. She practically glowed with joy, her dark eyes shining with unshed tears above her radiant smile. Each step down the aisle was steady and sure, as though she had walked this path in her heart every day for 20 years. Dale felt tears welling in his own eyes as he watched her approach. This was the little girl he had rescued, now a strong woman who had fought for their right to love. His heart swelled with pride and tenderness. When Hannah reached him, she took his rough hands in her smooth ones. They turned to face Reverend Harlan, who smiled broadly at the couple before him. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the church, "we are gathered here to witness what God ordained 2 decades ago, when a child's pure heart made a promise and a good man kept his word." As the preacher spoke of love's endurance and faith's reward, Dale could barely take his eyes off Hannah. She squeezed his hands at the mention of "for better or worse," her smile telling him they had already weathered the worst together. "The rings, please," Reverend Harlan said. Dale withdrew the wooden ring from his pocket. A murmur of appreciation rippled through the congregation as lamplight caught its polished surface. Hannah's eyes filled with tears as Dale slipped it onto her finger. "I carved this from the strongest pine," he whispered, "because our love, like these mountains, will stand forever." Hannah placed a simple gold band on Dale's finger, one she had saved from her seamstress earnings. "With this ring, I keep the promise I made as a child, now with a woman's heart." "By the authority vested in me," Reverend Harlan proclaimed, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Before he could finish saying, "You may kiss the bride," Hannah and Dale had already drawn together, their kiss sweet and tender beneath the glowing lanterns. The congregation burst into applause and cheers. Then someone began to sing, the familiar notes of Amazing Grace rising into the rafters. One by one, every voice joined in, until the little church trembled with the sound of joy and redemption. Hannah and Dale held each other close, their tears falling freely as the beloved hymn wrapped around them like a blessing. "God's promises never fail," Hannah whispered against Dale's chest. "They just need time to grow strong, like your pine ring." Dale kissed her forehead softly. 20 years was worth the wait, to have you as my wife at last." They turned to face their community, now truly their family, as the final verses of Amazing Grace filled the church with hope and healing. The lamplight caught the tears on every face, each person touched by the power of love that had overcome every obstacle to bring Hannah and Dale to this holy moment. Dawn broke crisp and clear over Redford, painting the fresh snow in shades of rose and gold. Hannah and Dale emerged from the church hand in hand, their footsteps making the first marks in the pristine blanket of white covering the street. Neighbors who had once turned away now lifted their hats and called out warm greetings. Mrs. Colton hurried over with a basket of fresh bread, while others brought small gifts to bless their new life together. White Dove approached with quiet dignity, drawing Hannah into a tender embrace. "You are my daughter now," she said softly, pressing a small leather pouch of sacred herbs into Hannah's hands. "For blessing your home." Dale loaded their wagon with care, securing supplies for their first days as husband and wife. Flour, coffee, sugar, and preserves nestled beside Hannah's trunk and wedding gifts. He helped her up onto the seat, wrapping a thick blanket around them both. As they started down the snowy street, children ran alongside the wagon, their sweet voices rising in song. "God be with you till we meet again," they sang, waving until the wagon crested the hill. At the cabin, Hannah stepped down into her new home. She moved straight to the hearth, her sure hands building a fire that soon filled the space with golden warmth. Dale stood beside her, watching the flames dance across her face. "You've turned my solitude into family," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Together they bowed their heads, giving thanks for justice found, mercy given, and love that had waited 20 years to bloom. Outside their window, the Colorado twilight painted the mountains in deep purple and rose, promising tomorrow's adventures would unfold beneath God's watchful eye. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.